Hello, good afternoon, students. In this lesson, we are going to study about the factors affecting the rate and nature of weathering. Dear students, if you can remember, we have studied about the various, what weathering is, and we also looked at the different types of weathering. This will give you the background to the factors influencing the rate and nature of weathering. When we look at the rate of weathering, we are looking at the speed at which weathering takes place, and when we talk of nature of weathering, we are looking at the physical weathering, we are looking at the chemical weathering, and we are looking at the biological weathering. So in this particular lesson, we are actually being exposed to what affects the chemical weathering, physical weathering, biological weathering, and at what speed does it happen. So these are the various factors which influence the rate and nature of weathering processes. One of these, actually they are in groups. We have the nature of the rock. We should also look at the climatic conditions or climatic factors. We shall look at the role of played by living organisms, which influence the rate and nature of weathering. We shall also look at the influence of relief in influencing the rate and nature of weathering. We shall look at the influence of time factor in influencing the rate and nature of weathering. Then lastly, we shall conclude the erosion as a factor of influencing the rate and nature of weathering. Now, under mineralogical composition as a factor influencing the rate and nature of weathering, under the nature of rocks, we shall look at the mineralogical composition or the mineralogical composition of the rocks. Different minerals found within the rocks influence rate and nature of weathering in different ways. For example, igneous rocks and metamorphic rocks are rich in chemical compositions because of the way in which they are formed. They are formed under hot temperatures and high pressure. So as a result, they are very rich in mineral composition, and therefore igneous rocks succumb easily to chemical weathering processes. They are easily affected by chemical weathering process because of their rich nature of mineral composition within the rock. Meanwhile, the sedimentary rocks are very stable when it comes to chemical weathering processes. They are not easily attacked by chemical weathering processes. Then also secondly, we look at rocks which are made up of high quartz content. Quartz is actually the silica content which are found within the rocks. Actually, rocks that are made up, rocks which have high silica content are highly acidic, and acidic minerals in the rocks tend to resist chemical weathering processes. So in other words, rocks that are made up of quartz, especially granitic rocks, tend to be resistant to chemical weathering processes, much as granitic rock is an igneous type of rock. Then we look at chemical composition of sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary rocks are rocks which have already been affected by weathering processes before, and therefore they have undergone chemical changes in the previous weathering processes. So in this way, when sedimentary rocks are attacked by chemical weathering processes, the rate of chemical weathering is low. Why? Because they had already undergone chemical changes in the previous weathering processes. So what you should bear in mind is that all sedimentary rocks are very stable to chemical weathering processes. They are not easily affected by chemical weathering because they had undergone chemical weathering in the previous weathering processes. Then another role played by minerals composition in rocks is the calcareous rocks. Calcareous rocks are rocks which are made up of limestones or dolomites. These are rocks which contain high calcium carbonate in them. So we call them calcareous rocks. The calcareous rocks easily succumb to chemical weathering processes, especially solution weathering, because they can easily be attacked by carbonation weathering process. So in other words, calcareous rocks easily succumb to carbonation weathering because they are made up of calcium carbonates. Then also, under mineralogical composition of rocks, there are some minerals, when they experience heating, they can rapidly expand. And when they also experience cooling, they can rapidly contract. So such rocks which are made up of minerals which can easily heat up and therefore expand and easily cool down and contract rapidly are easily affected by physical weathering processes, especially exfoliation, weathering, and granular disintegration. Then also mineral composition determines the rock color. For example, rocks which contain a high amount of quartz gives the minerals that light appearance, and therefore light colored rocks are not easily affected by physical weathering because they reflect back the sunlight, and therefore they cannot easily heat up than rocks which are dark colored rocks which can easily absorb heat, and therefore they can easily be affected by physical weathering processes, especially exfoliation weathering and granular disintegration. So those are the roles played by mineral composition in as far as the rate and nature of weathering is concerned. But you can see I've given you broad effect of mineral composition in a weathering, rate and nature of weathering. But this is just for academic purpose. Maybe for examination you can just choose one of these effect of mineral composition in rocks, then you explain in your examination, just one of them. Then another importance of rock structure in a mineral composition is the rock hardness. You will realize that hardy rocks like granitic rocks, they resist weathering processes. For example, they can easily resist physical weathering processes. The granitic rocks resist both physical and chemical weathering processes because of their hard nature. Then another role played by rocks in influencing the rate and nature of weathering is rock joints. Rocks which are made up of joints promote rapid chemical weathering processes because water and air can easily percolate along these joints, and therefore making weathering process to be very deep and rapid than rocks which do not have well-developed joints and cracks. In the same way, also rocks which are made up of bedding planes, there is easy movement of water and air along these bedding planes, and therefore bringing about deep weathering processes, especially deep chemical weathering processes, because of the easy movement of water through along the bedding planes. Then also we look at rock permeability in as far as the rate on nature of weathering is concerned. Permeable rocks are rocks which allow water to easily move through them. So in this case, permeable rocks experience deep chemical weathering because water can freely move through them up to great depth. Meanwhile, rocks which are impermeable will discourage the movement of water through them, and therefore they are less affected by chemical weathering processes because of the difficulties of movement of water through the rocks, which is one of the agents of weathering. Then another role played by rocks, the nature of rocks in as far as the rate and nature of weathering is concerned, is the rock age. Rocks are of different age, and the older rocks are very hard and resistant to both physical and chemical weathering processes because of that old age. Then the young rocks, especially the volcanic rocks and sedimentary rocks, can easily succumb to both chemical and physical weathering processes because of their youthful nature. So in this case, you can see that rocks, the nature of the rocks, affect the rate and nature of weathering in so many different ways. We had looked at the mineral composition of the rock. We had looked at the rock joints. We had looked at the rock age, and all these affect the rate and nature of weathering in different ways. The second aspect which influences the rate and nature of weathering is climatic factors. The nature of climate tend to affect the rate and nature of weathering in different ways. As you know, water and air are very important elements of climate, and they are also important elements of weathering processes. Now let's look at the influence of climate in weathering as far as the different climatic regions are concerned. First of all, let's look at the equatorial climatic region. In the equatorial climatic region, there is a high amount of rainfall throughout the year, and there is also high temperatures throughout the year. This high rainfall and warm temperatures throughout the year promotes rapid chemical weathering in the equatorial climatic region. But there is less physical weathering processes occurring because of these hot temperatures and heavy rainfall. So meaning in the equatorial climatic region, there is a high chemical weathering taking place because of the heavy rainfall and the warm temperatures, which accelerate the rate of chemical weathering. Then when we come to the savanna climatic region, we will realize that in the savanna climatic region there is both wet season and a dry season. So meaning in the savanna region we experience both chemical weathering and physical weathering. Chemical weathering is experienced during the wet season when there is a heavy rainfall, because the rain water now provides the raw materials which facilitates chemical weathering processes. Now when it comes to the dry season, when there is no rainfall and temperatures are hot with a limited cloud cover, it means there is a very hot temperatures during daytime and very cold temperatures at night. So in other words, this condition during the dry season promotes physical weathering processes, especially exfoliation weathering. So in summary, in the savanna climatic region, we have both chemical and physical weathering processes taking place. During the wet season, there is a high rate of chemical weathering process. Then during the dry season, there is a rapid physical weathering processes. Now, still under climate, let's look at the role played by the desert climatic region. The desert and semi-desert climatic region. In the desert and the semi-desert climatic region, we have very low rainfall taking place. Very, very low rainfall taking place. And then there is very hot temperatures during daytime and very cold temperatures at the night because of the absence of cloud cover. So in this case, there is a very high rate of physical weathering taking place in the desert and semi-desert climatic region. And the nature of weathering is basically exfoliation weathering because of the rift temperature changes during daytime and at night. Then it's also very important to look at mountain climate and its influence in weathering in the mountainous areas. In mountainous areas, especially the three mountains which experience the presence of ice, okay, there is a high rate of physical weathering, especially frosty shattering at the peak of the mountains because of the very cold temperatures. The cold temperatures allow water to freeze in the rock cracks, and in the process of freezing it expands, and as it expands it shatters up the rock with time. So in mountainous areas there is a high rate of frosty shattering, especially at the peak of the mountains, and this is very common at the top of glaciated mountains like Mount Rwenzori, Mount Kilimanjaro, and Mount Kenya. But when you come to the lower slopes of the mountains, where there is a heavy rainfall and warm temperatures throughout the year, again there is a high rate of chemical weathering processes at the lower slopes of the mountains at the lower altitudes. Then lastly, climate also determines the nature of vegetation. And you remember how important vegetation is in influencing weathering processes. So in the areas where there is a very heavy rainfall and warm temperatures throughout the year, there is a dense growth of tropical rainforests. And the presence of dense tropical rainforests will facilitate biological weathering processes through the pressure exerted by the roots of the trees, through the the acids produced in the process of decomposition of the plant leaves, what we call the humic acids. All this promotes rapid biological weathering in the tropical rainforest areas where there is a heavy rainfall taking place. Then in areas where there is very low rainfall, there is very thin vegetation cover. And this thin vegetation cover implies that the rocks are exposed to very hot temperatures, and this promotes a very rapid physical weathering in areas where there is very thin vegetation cover, especially in the desert climatic regions. Then the third aspect which influences the rate and nature of weathering is the role played by living organisms. Living organisms play a significant role in the rate and nature of weathering, and we are going to break the role of living organisms into two aspects. We shall look at the roles played by plants and as well as the roles played by animals. First of all, looking at the roles played by plants. In the tropical rainforest areas, there is a high rate of biological weathering because of the roots which penetrate through the rock cracks, and as they grow, they enlarge the rock cracks, and the rocks eventually break into fragments, especially in the tropical rainforest areas. Then also in the tropical rainforest areas, there is a high rate of the formation of humic acid in the process of decomposition, and this therefore means that there is a high rate of chemical weathering also in the tropical rainforest areas. Then besides, these tropical rainforests cover up the landscape. So in other words, they protect the land surface from erosion, meaning that they protect the underground rocks from weathering processes, because the rocks they reduce the rate of erosion, and therefore the underground rocks are not easily exposed to the agents of weathering processes. Then in the semi-desert areas where there is a less plant cover, there is a high rate of physical weathering, especially exfoliation weathering, because of the thin vegetation cover and because of the fact that the rocks are easily exposed to the agents of weathering, especially temperature changes. So that's the role played by plants in under this aspect of the living organisms. Now, turning to the role played by animals. The role played by animals, as we have already studied. Animals play significant role in weathering process, especially biological weathering. We look at burrowing animals. Burrowing animals create tunnels under the ground, and these tunnels facilitate free movement of water and air under the ground, and this therefore promotes deep chemical weathering under the ground. Also, the animal wastes like urine contains uric acid, and this uric acid promotes rapid chemical weathering and decomposition of the rocks. Then also the animals promote rapid deforestation, especially man. Man aids rapid deforestation and therefore exposing the underlying rocks to the agents of weathering, and this brings about rapid physical weathering in the areas which have been affected by deforestation processes. Then also man does mining, and this mining exposes the rocks which are under the ground, especially the open mining method exposes the underground rocks to the surface. It exposes the rocks at the surface, and therefore this promotes both physical and chemical weathering on the rocks. Then lastly, when man undertakes a plowing of the land or tilling on the land, the soils are churned up and the soils are made well aerated, and this also improves the drainage of the soil. This means there is a deep movement of water under the ground, and there is a deep movement of air. So the deep movement of water and air under the ground as a result of plowing processes will bring about deep chemical weathering processes. And you can see therefore man facilitates rapid rate of chemical weathering processes because of the plowing of the land, which churns up the land and improves both aeration and drainage. Number 4, we shall look at the role played by relief in as far as the weathering is concerned. At a high altitude, especially at the peaks of mountains like Kilimanjaro and Rwenzori. Rwenzori is about 5,110 meters above sea level. So at that altitude, temperatures are very cold, and therefore that cold temperature promotes frost shattering, because frost shattering weathering processes, because of the fact that the water can cool and freeze in the rocks, expands in volume, and end up breaking the rocks. Then also at the high altitudes of the mountains, the slope of the mountains are very steep. This means the steep slopes promote rapid running water over the landscape and therefore rapid erosion. This rapid erosion on the upper slopes of the mountain will expose the underlying rocks, the underground rocks at the surface, and eventually the rocks are exposed to the agents of weathering. Both physical and chemical weathering will take place deep under the ground because of the rapid rate of erosion on the steep slopes. Then lastly, in the low-lying areas, in valleys, there is a accumulation of water over the landscape, especially in swamps and so on. So in such areas, there is basically rapid chemical weathering process because of the accumulation of water under the ground. So in this case, you can see the nature of relief has greatly affected the rate and nature of weathering in so many different ways. Then number 5, we look at the time factor. Time is a very important aspect in geography, because all the physical and chemical activities takes place with the time. Weathering, breaking down of rocks does not happen just within a short period of time, within seconds, but it goes through seconds, it goes through minutes, and sometimes it goes through years for you to realize that the weathering has taken place within a certain type of rock. There are some rocks which can weather down completely after thousands of years, you see. So in this case, time is a very important factor in as far as weathering, the rate and nature of weathering is concerned. The longer the time is, the more the rocks exposed to the agents of weathering, for example, water and air, and therefore the deeper the weathering process will be. And the shorter time the rocks are exposed to the agents of weathering, like water and air, the shorter time will be the rate, the weathering processes, and therefore the weathering will be short and incomplete. It will not go so deep under the ground because of the short period of time the rocks are exposed to the agents of weathering. Then lastly, we shall look at the roles played by erosion in the rate and nature of weathering. Erosion, as you know, is the removal of the overlying rock strata by running water, wind, and animals. So, in other words, when the overlying weathered rocks are removed and transported away, it means the rocks which are under the ground, the rocks which would not have been exposed at the surface to the agents of weathering will now be exposed. And this means that the underground rocks will continuously be exposed to the agents of weathering, and eventually deep weathering takes place. So, in areas where there is a rapid erosion, it means the underground rocks are exposed to weathering, agents of weathering, and there will be deep chemical and physical weathering taking place in the area. So this is, my dear students, what I want to discuss with you, the rate and nature of weathering. So if you have any other question or some problems, you can put the questions in our platform so that I can get it and I shall tackle with you. Or you can send some WhatsApp messages, I will get. Otherwise, I thank you very much. Have a blessed day, and I also wish you enjoyment of this lesson.